Hello, everybody. So today we're talking about Socrates and the dialogue, the Euthyphro from Plato. So to start out, let's put everything in context. So we've already discussed this, the pre-Socratics, the Milesian naturalists, Parmenides, and the atomists. And we see that they're questioning the nature of reality, trying to find out what the underlying structure is. And we see that there's profound disagreement among them. And you might wonder, how are we supposed to solve these disagreements? Right? So if Thales and Anaximenes have a disagreement about whether or not water or air makes up the fundamental unit of reality, and they both give good reasons for why you might think the unit they chose is the proper one, how are we going to settle the dispute between the two? Now, if you think there's something like objective facts in the world, then this becomes a little bit easier to answer, right? So if we think everything's just relative, well, then you might say, okay, Thales is right in his own subjective sense, given the facts that he knows, and Anaximenes is correct, given his own subjective interpretation of the world. But that's not very satisfying, right? We want to know not just what seems right given our own subjective standpoint, we want to know which viewpoint actually is correct. Right? So both of these views can't be correct at the same time, right? It can't be that water is the fundamental unit of reality, and also air is the fundamental unit of reality. Those both can't be true at the same time. And so if we have access to objective facts in the world, then we can access those objective facts and figure out, well, which fact is in there? Is it that water is the fundamental unit, or is it that air is the fundamental unit? And so this disagreement among all of the pre-Socratics lends itself to what we're going to see from Socrates. So keep that in mind. That's sort of our background this whole time. To give you some background on Socrates, he was born in 469 BC and lived until 399 BC, at which time he was put to death by the city of Athens. We'll talk about why that was in a second. But one of the first things we should know, we already talked about this a little bit with the pre-Socratics, right? We don't have a lot of text for the pre-Socratics. Well, we actually have zero text for Socrates. And that's because Socrates never wrote anything down. He just sort of went around the city talking to people about philosophy all the time, but never actually writing anything down. He did all of his thinking and discussion out in public as an act of philosophy. So why are we talking about Socrates? How can we talk about Socrates? Well, just as we talked about the Milesian naturalists through the testimony of Aristotle, we talk about Socrates mostly through the testimony of Plato. So Plato was a student of Socrates and uses Socrates as a character in the dialogues that Plato writes. So the Euthyphro is a dialogue that hopefully you've read now before you started watching this lecture, that Plato wrote and uses Socrates as a character in that dialogue. And so obviously there's some doubt about what the historical Socrates actually thought, what the man actually thought. Normally how it divides up is we think in some of the earlier dialogues, Plato is using the character Socrates to try and make sense of the views Socrates put forward. So in the early dialogues, we have pretty good evidence that these might have been the views that Socrates actually held, or at least something close, right? Plato's interpretation of what Socrates was saying. And then as we get into the middle and late dialogues of Plato, it seems we get further and further away from what the historical man thought, and he's being used more as just a character. But so we still get this idea of his project, right? So what is Socrates' sort of catalyst for his whole entire project? And we'll obviously talk about what his project is here in a second. Well, so first we have that disagreement among the pre-Socratics, right? We have this lack of uniformity. They're all asking the same question, right? What is the fundamental nature of reality? And they're all getting wildly different answers, right? So some like Parmenides and the atomists, say, well, there's not even any change in the world. Whereas the Milesian naturalists obviously all thought there was change. And there's these fundamental disagreements happening between those who want reason, those who value experience more. Uh, so Socrates was inspired by this to find uh, if he could discover any of these objective facts about the world. Like, how do we go about finding the answer to these difficult questions that the pre-Socratics are asking? Or are we just stuck bickering back and forth forever? There has to be something we can appeal to, so how do we find it? Okay, and then second, he was inspired by a group called the Sophists. The Sophists were a group in the Mediterranean basin who spent time in Athens, and they went around essentially selling the art of rhetoric, right, which is your ability to take any argument and sort of give it its most convincing form, right, or advance your ability for speech making, right? So when you're talking about pure rhetoric, you're not really worried about whether or not the argument is correct. You're just worried about saying sentences in such a way that they have pull on people. Right? So we see this a lot in ethical debates today, right? When people say abortion is murder, right? They're just using rhetoric to try and make a strong appeal to your emotions. But they're not actually giving us the argument there, right? And you might think, okay, so we have the argument the philosopher gives about whether or not abortion is morally permissible. It's really dry, sort of boring. Even if we think his conclusion is the right one, like it just didn't grab us how he got there, right? If you're studying rhetoric, as the Sophists were, you might not have a very ironclad argument, but it's not going to be dry. It's going to grab your attention right from the beginning. So the Sophists were teaching rhetoric, and one of the views that the Sophists tended to hold was that everything was relative. And so you got to see that a little bit in the comic above with Socrates man there. His opponent in the comic was representative of the Sophist view, right? He thought that morality and truth were all relative, and sometimes the Sophists thought that truth and morality were relative because they could take any argument and make it seem convincing, right? So if you have an argument on both sides that is convincing, it just seems like we have these subjective interpretations of fact. And so the Sophists tended to hold these relativist views. And so part of what's motivating Socrates, or at least the character Socrates in the Euthyphro and the other dialogues through Plato, is that he wants to find a way to undermine this relativism. So if he can find objective facts in the world, then he can undermine the relativism of the Sophists. So two things inspiring Socrates. One, the disagreement and lack of uniformity among the pre-Socratics, and two, the relativism of the Sophists. He wanted to overcome both of these things. Okay, and then sort of a final fun fact about Socrates before we actually dive into the dialogue. Socrates was sentenced to death, as I mentioned earlier, in 399 BC. And why was he sentenced to death? Well, he was sentenced to death for corrupting the youth and impiety, or not believing in the gods, the traditional gods of the state. So why was he said to have corrupted the youth? Well, essentially, Socrates went around talking to all of the famous sons of politicians and all the youth of the wealthy classes in Athens who had free time. He would go around, talk to them about philosophy, and essentially he would question whether their fathers knew anything, right? Whether the traditional views of the state were any good, right? He was doing this critical thinking that we're supposed to be doing in philosophy, but he was talking to well-to-do young men in the city of Athens. And so now these young men have these tools with them to go and question all the teachings of the state and the teachings of their father and question authority, right? So he was said to have corrupted the youth for that reason, and impiety just because he questioned whether or not the traditional gods existed, right? So even if he still did believe in the gods of the state, just that questioning was enough to claim that he was impious. Okay, so now we're going to get into the actual dialogue. So what is he going to be trying to do? Well, as you saw in the dialogue, they're trying to define piety. And so Socrates' answer for all of the relativism and overcoming disagreement and lacking uniformity is to find these universal definitions. Right? So he thinks we can study these words, study these important words like piety and justice, and so on. There's a bunch of different words they inspect in each of the different dialogues, but the big ones we'll be dealing with are piety and justice. And he thinks if we can test out definitions for these words and find out, okay, well, this definition is flawed for that reason, let's get rid of it. This definition is flawed for another reason, let's get rid of it. Eventually, we'll just be left with the true definition of piety. Right? It won't be relative to the person. So we'll say the sophists come in and have a definition of piety. Socrates comes in and has a definition of piety. Euthyphro comes in, has a definition of piety. It can't be that all three of them hold the correct definition of piety. They might all be wrong, but certainly at least two of them are wrong. Right? They can't have two or more correct definitions of piety. So if that's true, and we'll discuss why there's some reason to think that is true later when we discuss Plato. If Socrates is able to find these universal definitions, then he's able to find that objective fact he was looking for, and he's able to overcome the worries he had about the pre-Socratics and the sophists. Okay, so in the next video, we'll begin running through the definitions they talk about in the